mother was a skilled homemaker and an Army wife. You'll hear so much more about her story. She graduated from Scripps College in Claremont, California, and then on to UC Berkeley, and then to the Sanford School of Medicine. Her husband is Bob Gutman, who many of you know from around here. Hopefully you know Laura as well. She's got two children, sorry. Just two. Plenty of work. And you'll hear so much more about her story as she goes along today. So she's recently published a book, Army Brat. She'll be telling you about her book and her life story, and I'm excited to hear and learn alongside of you. So without further ado, here's Laura.
Thank you everybody. Thank you for coming. I also want to thank Jack and JCC for hosting this. This is wonderful. Wonderful opportunity. I really appreciate it. Can you hear okay? Okay. It took about a year to write a story of how I grew up. I grew up as an Army brat. The first breath I took was at the West Point Station Hospital, where my father was teaching at the time, career Army officer. So I'm the most quintessential Army brat you could ever possibly meet. A comment about the name, by the way, brat. It's usually pejorative, of course. What happened was that kids and mothers were called dependents, and they didn't like that very much. And at the beginning of World War II, there was a general who decided that this had to stop. We have to have a better term. And the British had a term called a brat, which was a British regimental attached traveler, which meant a child who was allowed to travel with their career parents in the British Army. So that was what they used, and we adopted that name. And I will tell you that Army brats, we glommed onto that name. That is the correct term. We love it, we own it, and it is not a pejorative. It is the term for children who follow their families around for military reasons. Mostly Army. It's genericized into military brats very often, but it is mostly the Army which developed it and influenced it. So my story is somewhat unique, and there are a couple reasons for that. I've thought about that. Why are there not a lot of other stories of children who came into Army brathood and, from the beginning of World War II on? There are many stories of Army brats, starting at the very end of World War II and then considerably more afterward, but not, I think, another history of a child who went through the full process. And I think that in part is part of the history of what happened. The pre-war Army in the US was so tiny. I don't think people in general understand. We almost didn't have an army. Our total Army number was 180,000. That's it. We were smaller than the Army of Portugal. We had almost nothing. And during that period of time, most of the officer corps was being trained at West Point, and they were putting out classes in the 200s. So that was the population for the leadership that had gone on. That was from about in the 1910s and 20s. And those tiny populations from West Point continued through the middle 1930s. Late in the 1930s, they bulked up and they were having classes of about 400 or so. But they were never large, and that was where they got their leadership. The other thing is that a number of places that we were sent, they were places which were called not accompanied. And that means that the only families that could come were families of senior officers and senior, very senior enlisted men, so that the children of from the lower ranks were not present in those places, and a number of them were very consequential historically. So for those reasons, it happened that my family was in places that are historically important enduring events. My view of World War II is that it began for the United States at least, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Of course, the British and other countries had been at it for a very long time before, but for the United States, it really did begin with Pearl Harbor. And in my mind, it ended really about the time of the Berlin airlift. That was the time that the United States began seriously to become allies with Germany, and that we began to look at Russia as our actual, if not, well, really an enemy, not just a competitor, but an enemy. And that was the World War II era. And then immediately after that, it went on into the Korean War and Vietnam War. And so in the book I write during the time that I was myself attached to the military in some serious way. And it ended, as it turns out, at the time that we left Seattle and came to Durham. So it was about 30, age 30 at that point. The events that occurred, if you want to look at the book, and I have some pictures I'll show at the end of this, a few pictures to put up. So I was about 4 at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and my onset of good memory begins at that point. So as it turned out, that was just a happenstance. I was just a little over 4, and we were stationed in Hawaii. My father, at that point, was a senior in the police department and the fire department, career military, and we were at Schofield Barracks, and Wheeler Airfield is the airfield there. This is in the center of the island of Hawaii, Oahu, and our little house was right at the edge of the airfield. You had our house, and then a backyard, very relaxed backyard, and some chicken wire fence, and then there was the airfield. Now, the pre-war Air Force was also tiny, and it was part of the Army. So that 180,000 men, that included our Air Force. That was the Army Air Force, that's what it was. And it was much later that it became its own unit, but at that point, that's what it was. So I was used to seeing, as a child, planes come in and taxi. This is at the very end where planes, of the airfield, where planes went to be serviced and relaxed. And so I got to watch the attack on that airfield, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of that. That was the beginning of my life as an Army brat, from the point of view of our personal life had been kind of organized up until then. I kind of knew what was going on. Things were pretty predictable. I had 2 parents. My father came home at the end of the day, and all of that sort of good stuff. And at that point, of course, all that changed. So what happened, if you want to look at the book, I detail how it was for us after the attack and what happened to the people there. But my father was needed immediately back to the United States to begin training troops. So we knew that we had to go from this little pretend army into what turned out, of course, to be a massive force, which we used in two fields, both Europe and the Far East, for the war. So the next big saga has to do with our living through these little training positions. What happened was bunches of training posts were set up to begin to create the troops which were needed, and with the skills which were needed. And my father being a West Pointer and senior, what would happen is that a given post would train up a group of troops and then be ready for their senior trainer, and Dad would show up. What would happen with us is he would be stationed somewhere, housing would become available, we would move in, kind of, and about that time, he'd finished training the troops that he was there, he'd get stationed at the next place, the requisition for housing would happen, he'd take off, we would eventually get new housing, we would sort of pack, we'd sort of take off, we're at the next place. So that went on very extremely. It was extremely chaotic. And by the time I was 16, I had lived in 20 different places, and with 20 different schools, and all of that sort of thing. Each time, of course, had its own terrible side of it. I lost all my friends each time. It's like they all died right here, a mass death, and I was now, as usual, nobody from nowhere, and no history. Nobody knew anything about where I'd come from, and I sort of show up. Where we were on bases, it was fine because the other kids knew, but everybody was living through the same thing. But where we were living in a civilian community, they had no idea what was going on, and I would sort of show up in mid-year and all of that sort of thing. Just as a personal comment, it was sometimes it really was terrible, and somewhere in the 4th grade, I pretty much lost it, and I couldn't say my name. I was at a new school, and a nice teacher said, would you please stand up and introduce yourself? We're so glad to have you. And I was just mute. I couldn't say a word. I could not say anything. And so that solved itself. And it was, I got myself back together. But that was the nature of life for the Army brats at that time period. So time passed, we developed our army, and Dad was a trained warrior. He yearned to have a part in the battles that we were fighting, and he eventually was assigned a battalion in Patton's army. One of the saving graces of all of this for me and the other kids was a terrifically strong sense that we were part of a purpose-driven life. Our accomplishments were important. It was important that we do well, that we participate. We were part of this burgeoning army. As children, we served the nation. We felt that we did. We were told that we did. A little sideline on that. At one point, Dad was looking for a command. We were, I think, in Georgia, maybe, and it looked as if he might get a command that he wanted. He didn't get it then. He got it when he wanted a little later, but he was off, and it looked as if he might be shipped out. And we travel for civilians was hopeless, absolutely hopeless, and I was just outraged at the idea that he might take off and we couldn't say goodbye to him. So my mother finally said, "Honey, there's only one person who can solve our travel problems, and that is President Roosevelt. So here is a piece of paper, here's a pen, and I think you should write it." And she was just, up to here in my complaining, and she had a solution. So I did, and a couple weeks later, ring, 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 it was President Roosevelt to tell me that I had my duties. My father was doing his duty, and mine was to take care of my mother, to be brave, and to understand that everybody had their own duties and their own roles. And so you cannot be, you could not be more, you're part of the team than that, I don't think. It was of course, I should have asked, is anybody here, are there any other military brats here? No.
Not a brat.
Yeah.
My father is a fourth generation West Pointer.
Yeah.
And I was born in Frankfurt, Germany at the Army, but he soon left the service and went to hotel management. So I didn't have the experience you did, certainly another era of family, but I'm steeped in the history and the tradition.
I'm sure he experienced a lot of this. We would have had a lot to talk about. Yeah.
I'm going to get history
Yeah.
for him.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was born in Farmville, Virginia, in the Second World War. I was the head of the dental.
And your father was doing what?
The head of the dental clinic at the Army base.
Head of the dental clinic.
Oh, I'm glad you're here. Thank you. Yeah. Those who were here at, also during the war in any capacity, you probably remember how difficult that was. My father was a consequential leader, as he's talked about in several books having to do with the history of Patton's army, and he was wounded 3 times. We all experienced that. Following the war, we were sent back very early to Germany in the Army of Occupation. This is 1947. So I'll show you a couple pictures of this. It was absolutely a horrific situation there. It was, the destruction was horrific. Our living circumstances was very poor. The Germans were in terrible straits, and so we were not to buy food off the German market at all. Consequently, we had about a year of frozen turkey, spam, frozen. There were chickens, and there was some steak. Vegetables, hardly. I mean, they were all canned. We had canned corn, canned beans, and so forth. We certainly didn't have any fresh products. And we had nasty orange juice that had been, something had been done to it. And, and we had powdered milk. And there was no hunger. You know, among the Americans, there was certainly no hunger. But it was very, very limited. And we were, it was probably late 48, early 49, before we actually got food again. It was, everything smelled bad. I concluded that you must not lose a war. Don't start a war unless you have to, meaning absolutely existentially have to. And if you are caught in a war, you must do everything that needs to be done to be sure that you win the war. That sort of determination, of course, carries over into adulthood. You become very sensitive to the way things are moving nationally. Are we being careful about our obligations? Are we being careful about our allies? Are we ensuring that we are sufficiently strong that we do not look like easy prey? This is a a big issue. The Berlin airlift went on, and Dad was part of the planning for the defense of Western Europe, and we were in Berlin for a little bit during that period. This was a siege from 1948 through 1949 that the Russians imposed, and during that time there was a great deal of fear that the Russians actually intended to reinvade Western Europe. They were very armed up. They were very threatening, and it looked very, very, very bad. The military was trying to send families home, and my mother was having none of that. We'd been separated much too much already, and but for a while we did take off for Switzerland in order to get ourselves out of the way. So I consider that one of the places I lived, and so forth. So and then we spent a year in France while he was writing the protocols for NATO. This was part of the consequence of the problems that we've been having with Russia. It was finally realized that we needed to have a joint plan for the defense of Western Europe, and so that was organized in France, and Dad was the officer who was the liaison between the U.S. Army and the diplomats who were writing the protocols. So, just a little bit of personal history here. The consequence of all of this to schooling, as you can imagine, was intense. Basically, I went to school alternate years. I had schooling I had excellent schooling in second grade, fourth grade, sixth grade, eighth grade, and 3 years of high school. The other years, we were either moving such that I got nothing out of it, or we were in a place that didn't have appropriate schooling, or at one point I refused, and successfully. And we had homeschooling for that year. It's a saga, and I'll let you read about it if you want. by the 5th grade, I had realized, and this happens to a lot of Army brats, by the way, I had realized that it was up to me. Whatever I was going to do, whatever I needed to know, and I realized how much I needed to know, you know, that I really had a good understanding that education was essential and had to happen. That was up to me. It was up to me to do it, to find it, and to altogether up to me. I became very radical from that point of view. At one point, the year in France began with my being in a little French. We were staying in a village outside of Fontainebleau, so it's a very small French village. And the teacher there spoke French and German, and I spoke English and German. So she was teaching the class in French and then would break off to explain to me in German. This was so shortly after the war. This was a part of France that had just a brutal time with the Germans. And of course, everybody knew who I was, that I wasn't German, but I didn't like being in the class, speaking German, and of course, it was very destructive to the class because the teacher had to break off. If I had another question, she had to break off again, and this just wasn't working. So I refused. I said, no, I'm not doing this. And it had a wonderful effect. The local principal was a lovely, cultured, classical Frenchman. He wasn't just the local principal. He also was the general go-to person for conflicts. He was very well known throughout that whole area for being somebody who could usually find outcomes to conflicts which were kind of win-win arrangements. He was very good at that. And French law was that every child must be educated, no exceptions. And so a plan had to be made. So I wound up that year with readings that were selected by him, my parents, and me, and writing reports to him. And it brought me into reading in some depth, along with reports, of authors I probably would never have read otherwise. I mean, it was like a year of self-education in a very wonderful way. I loved it. And so that's kind of the way that this worked. On the other years when I wasn't in regular school, my mother was very educated, and they were very attentive to this. So we muddled through that, and I would say that as a whole, preparing for adulthood with the assumption that it's up to you, this on-the-job training, you just have to do it, is not a bad way to start. And so there's that. There have been studies, a little bit, sociological studies done on Army brats, a little bit. We're hard to get a hold of because there's no record of us. Once we age out, as far as benefits are concerned, nobody keeps track of us. So it's hard to get a group of Army brats together. But a couple of the generalizations, and I think I certainly check off a bunch of them personally. Marriages, by the way, tend to be more durable than in the general population, which is nice. Army brats tend to go into the helping professions, like the military is a big one. This is a family cycle that many military brats come from. My own family had a very long history, both sides of my family, of military service. Um, there's that, but also police, and for women, nursing and medicine. So check that off. We have a long history of military brats being kind of a little bit of loners. There is not much of a fear of having to join a group. You don't feel that way. That's because we never could. So we never developed particular skills in that. And so some brats feel very comfortable at being the oddball out, taking unpopular positions on issues, and others keep a low profile and just don't participate. So I think probably both, probably both of those. So I would say that as a group we can feel all right about ourselves. Now my brothers, of course, had a different, I have two younger brothers. One is 4 years younger, and so he was present for a lot of this, and he had different experiences to a considerable extent. And we've talked about this a lot. I describe him in the book. And he was present in the home at a later point in our family's life. My mother, late in, about the time I was heading out the door for college and things like that, my mother had had enough of other people telling her where she had to live and what she had to do, and she divorced my father. He was opposed to it. He didn't think that she was ready to be independent, and but that is what happened, and Benj was there during that whole period of time. My father did something so amazing that I have to mention it. He liked being married, and he wanted a wife, so he was a classical upper Midwestern gentleman, and so he did not have affairs. What he had was serial marriages, many, very short ones. They didn't work out well. We had annulments, and we're not. My brother and I are really not sure how many marriages there were. We're pretty sure there were at least 5, and there may have been more. But then he did finally find Hazel, a lovely woman in Seattle, and a blessing to our family in every way. I'm going to say one more thing, and then maybe there's some questions or whatever. So this is the JCC, and I think maybe you would like to know what we knew and thought about the Jews. Okay. At home, during the war, while Dad was in Europe fighting, my mother, who was not an angry person and usually kept her anger pretty well, she didn't swear, among other things. She would occasionally just lose it, just cursing, kicking the walls, maybe throwing some pots and pans around. And what she was hearing had to do with the opening of some of the camps and some of the recognition of what was happening in Europe as far as murder, sites of murder. She was just outraged at it. At the time, I remember this, it was very dramatic. At the time, I cannot tell you that it was clear that Jews were the prime target. I understood that the Germans were mistreating civilians in some targeted, horrible way, but who they were exactly, I didn't know. I myself, so I'm a convert, and I grew up as a very old-timey Episcopalian, very attached to the Old Testament. I was quite religiously oriented, and I was totally unaware of Jews currently. If I had been asked, who are the Jews, I would have said they're this incredible tribe in ancient Israel who God chose to speak to and loved. And the idea that there were Jews living among us never occurred to me. I wouldn't have known that. That's through my childhood. That was the way it was. So I can't tell you what my mother knew about that. I don't really know. Then we got to Europe, and my mother had language skills, and she had German friends, and from time to time I would ask her, what, do you, by then I figured out what had happened, and I would ask her, do your friends say, what do they say? What do they know about what was going on? And she said that they would give some vague answer and move on to another topic. That it was just not a topic that they were willing to talk about at all. By then, I knew that German schools were requiring that the schools teach about the criminality of the Nazi empire, and so in theory it was not a topic that was forbidden that people could talk about, but I'm not sure that was the reality for a long time. I think it probably wasn't, and that is, I think in through. So this goes. We got to Europe in '47. We left in '51, and I think that throughout that period of time, that there was very muted, if any, information in general about what had happened to the Jews. I tried to look up a little bit about what the U.S. press itself was producing at that time, and I found a very good article that looked into that. What was the New York Times doing? The paper of record. What was the New York Times doing? And the answer seems to be that they were reporting. They were reporting consistently from a very early period on about, specifically about the Jews, about the murderers, about the camps. But what they were doing was putting it in the far inside of this. Remember, the New York Times was a very large newspaper. The daily papers were many pages long, many, and the weekly sections were extremely large. And so a small article, hidden on page 35, unless you are a big news junkie, you would have missed it altogether. And that seems to be what happened. So when the Times are charged with having failed to report, it's not quite true, but in a way it is true, because they reported it in a way that people never saw. And my mother was kind of a news junkie, and I think that she glommed onto a few of these articles, but I think that was a very rare event. So why don't we just chat a little bit? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say that I was raised in Staten Island, in the area of 5 hours from New York. And
You want to use this?
Sisters of Charity. And those nuns were incredibly progressive, and we learned, I want to say, 5th grade on about the Holocaust, about the World War II, it was, well, it was like changing, okay, of course.
So what time, when was this?
That was 1969, so,
Yeah.
so 1966, maybe, 1967. But what I want to say is that I moved to North Carolina in my 30s, late 30s, and I was sitting in a 2-year, in Wake Tech, I was sitting in a class about poetry, and it was Sylvia Plath that we were reviewing, and I was absolutely horrified that I was